Hello everybody. In my last video, I continued giving my response to a video made by RationalityRules on the moral argument, and in this video, I'll be concluding my response to his video. Also, I would just ask that if you enjoyed the video, click the like button, and if you really enjoyed the video, you can subscribe to keep up with my newest videos. So, with that said, let's get into it.
But here's where things get really quite interesting. Craig has frequently stated that he doesn't use the term absolute moral values because
to say they're absolute moral values could be taken to mean that certain moral duties hold regardless of the circumstances you're in. So thou shalt not kill regardless of the fact that a terrorist is about to kill your wife and children.
And he frequently states that he deliberately uses the term objective morality, stating that objective moral values mean
that in any given situation in which you might find yourself, there is something that is really right and really wrong, independently of human opinion. But clearly that might vary with the circumstances. In some cases it would be morally permissible to kill, but in other cases it would be morally impermissible to kill. So what I'm talking about is objective right and wrong, but not necessarily absolutes that take no cognizance of the circumstances in which a person finds himself.
Pay very close attention to Dr. Craig's wording here. Notice that in talking about objective morality, he says that something is really right or really wrong, but that this might vary with the circumstances. Later, he says, what I'm talking about is objective right and wrong, but not necessarily absolutes.
But listen carefully to the following clip of him explaining objective moral values to a different audience.
What we're talking about here are unconditional obligations or unconditional goods or evils. Yes, I think that there clearly are. For example, it's unconditionally good to be a loving and generous person. And I think that when most of us reflect on our moral experience, we do see that there is a clear, objective, unconditional difference between modes of behavior.
Sorry, Craig, but did you just say that it's unconditionally good to be a loving and generous person? That, for example, if a terrorist was about to kill your wife and child, you would have to be loving and generous towards him unconditionally, i.e., regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the fact that he's about to kill your wife and children. Because, as you have stated many times before, that's an absolute statement, not an objective or relative one. This, my friends, is how you play tennis without the net. And this is a prime example of Craig either intentionally or unintentionally committing an equivocation fallacy.
First off, I haven't been able to find the talk where this quote is taken from, so I don't know the immediate context, but I know Dr. Craig's work, and I know that he goes to great lengths to distinguish between objective and absolute morality. In fact, you gave one such example of this previously in your video. This leads me to believe that he isn't just blatantly contradicting himself. I wish I could listen to what Dr. Craig said directly before saying, what we're talking about here is, I wonder if he was already going off on a tangent about absolute morality, and that's what he meant when he said, what we're talking about here is. Perhaps he was already talking about absolute morality in the first place. Now, of course, this is only my speculation, but even if Dr. Craig was contradicting himself here, that wouldn't show that the moral argument is flawed. That would just show that Dr. Craig mistakenly espoused an inconsistent view. Perhaps the reason you see a contradiction here is because you think that objective morality and absolute morality are just completely separate and incompatible with each other. I don't know if you actually believe this, but I'm really just trying to cover all the bases here of finding out why you think this is an equivocation. If you do think that these things are incompatible with each other, then you've simply got a wrong understanding of objective and absolute morality. Absolute morality is a type, a subset of objective morality, such that if some moral truth is absolute, then it has to be objective. On the flip side, if some moral truth is objective, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's absolute, though it could be. You can completely accept that some moral truths are absolute while others aren't. For example, let's look at the situation of the terrorist who is about to kill your wife and child. Dr. Craig says that we have an absolute moral duty to be loving. That is, there is absolutely no situation in which we should not be loving. But what is the most loving thing to do in any given situation might vary based on that situation. In most cases, killing is not permissible, but in this case, it very well might be the most loving thing to kill the terrorist, as he is about to kill your wife and child. The absolute principle that you should always be loving still holds, but the exemplification of this principle might vary from circumstance to circumstance.
Now, if I'm honest, the three flaws that we've just covered are each more than enough to destroy Craig's moral argument. But for what it's worth, here's a few additional ones. It might be subtle, but Craig and the proponents of his moral argument very often commit an argument from ignorance. They do this because they implicitly assert, and sometimes explicitly, that only their very specific God could be responsible for the existence of objective moral values, without justifying why this is the case. In fact, they often state,
Take away God, and what basis then remains for objective moral duties?
which translated from fluffland to English means, we don't know, therefore God. My very specific God.
I don't know one proponent of the moral argument who says that only a very, very specific God could possibly serve as the foundation for morality. Though I will say, if someone out there is saying that, stop it. Stop it. That's not what the argument says. The argument just claims that some God in general must exist for there to be a proper foundation for objective morality. Now, you can agree with this or disagree with this, but you can't deny that that is in fact what the argument claims. When Dr. Craig says, take away God, and what basis then remains for objective moral duties, he is not simply saying, we don't know, therefore God. What he's doing is referring to his justification of the claim that on atheism, there doesn't seem to be any plausible basis on which to affirm objective morality. If you're a materialist or a naturalist and you believe that the physical world is all that exists, then you're stuck with the obvious problem of why a universe, which seems so indifferent to matters of morality, and that works in such a mechanical fashion, should nevertheless be imbued with or give rise to moral values, let alone moral duties and moral accountability. If you aren't a naturalist and you believe, for example, that Platonism is true and that moral abstract objects exist, like justice, then you face a couple of different problems. First, why think these abstract objects exist in the first place? And more fundamentally, what does it even mean to say that justice just exists, independent of any person? It makes sense to talk about justice in the context of people. A person, for example, can be just. But what does it even mean to say that justice simply exists by itself, independent of any person? Furthermore, regardless of whether you're a naturalist or a Platonist, It seems incredibly unlikely that the process of evolution, which on atheism is unguided, should nevertheless give rise to a type of animal that corresponds with this realm of abstract moral objects. Dr. Craig himself quips, "It is almost as if the moral realm knew that we were coming." This is why many people accept the first premise of the moral argument. When Dr. Craig says, "Take away God, and what basis then remains for objective moral duties?" he is not simply saying, "We don't know, therefore God." He's pointing out real, conceptual, and probabilistic difficulties with trying to ground objective morality on an atheistic view.
A fourth major flaw that Craig's moral argument commits, and one that shares a strong relationship with the argument from ignorance, is the shifting of the burden of proof. In their assertion that, if not who, then what, they are very clearly trying to switch the burden of proof, because they are indirectly asserting that if you can't account for objective moral values, then their assertion must be true.
Everything I've just said applies here as well. There are reasons for thinking that atheism cannot furnish a proper foundation for morality. Now, did these reasons make the truth of premise 1 absolutely certain? I would argue no. What these reasons do is cast significant doubt on the idea that objective morality can be properly grounded on an atheistic view, thus making the first premise more probable than not.
In their assertion that, if not who, then what, they are very clearly trying to switch the burden of proof, because they are indirectly asserting that if you can't account for objective moral values, then their assertion must be true. Which isn't just ludicrous, it's actually a subtle black and white fallacy. But don't get me started on that one.
I agree that if someone claimed either you give an account of objective morality or my specific God is responsible for it, that would be a false dilemma. But again, I never have actually met or heard of any proponent of the moral argument who says this. The argument is not about atheism versus my very specific God. The argument is about atheism versus theism in general.
And finally, as the last flaw that I'll raise in this video, we have the fact that Craig's moral argument doesn't support monotheism. Even if objective moral values existed in the way that Craig insists, this wouldn't even suggest, let alone prove, that a single God is responsible. There is no reason to rule out the possibility that many gods are responsible. And in fact, there is no reason to rule out the possibility that many petulant and childish gods were responsible that have since died. The point being, Craig's argument supports theism, not monotheism, and certainly not his specific monotheism.
The primary reason for preferring one god over many gods comes from Occam's razor, the idea that we shouldn't multiply causes beyond necessity. If one god can do the trick, why invoke another? Now, Occam's razor doesn't prove monotheism, but it gives us reason for preferring one god over many. Furthermore, I'm honestly inclined to just say, who cares? It doesn't seem like much of a criticism to fault a theistic argument for only proving theism. That's what it was supposed to do in the first place. I will say, though, that the idea of many petulant and mortal gods being the foundation for morality seems like an utterly hopeless possibility. Being petulant is a moral deficit. So if a being is petulant, that being can't possibly be the standard of morality. If it was the standard of morality, then being petulant would have to be morally virtuous, which it's not. Also, I think a good argument can be made that if the source of objective morality dies, in the sense that it no longer exists, then the source for objective morality no longer exists. Ergo, objective morality does not exist. But according to the moral argument, there is objective morality. which means that if the argument is sound, then at the very least, the source of objective morality still exists.
Of course, Craig uses additional arguments to try and justify his specific monotheism, but the case in point here being is that his argument does not.
If there are typically additional arguments given to prefer monotheism over some other kind of theism, then it doesn't seem like much of a fault of the moral argument that it doesn't itself prove monotheism. These additional arguments will pick up right where the moral argument left off. So that is the end of my response to the video by RationalityRules. I certainly didn't expect it to take up 3 of my videos, but I'm hoping that you're able to learn some good information. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to share it with someone you know and subscribe to keep up with my newest videos. If you feel like you have something to say, or if you have some thoughts or objections, definitely leave a comment. I love getting comments. I have absolutely no clue what my next video will be about, but I'm sure I'll know when the time comes. So, stay tuned for that video, and I'll see you then.